I think I speak for the whole committee in thanking all three of you for being here and for educating us and the American people about what you and, in your case, your child has experienced. Let me begin my questioning with Ms. Vasquez. And I know you have experience, obviously, not only with yourself, but you have interacted with many, many hundreds of people with long COVID. Is one of the frustrations that the medical community or others do not believe, in fact, what you are experiencing? Is that one of the problems that you're going through?
Yes, absolutely. I daily, it seems like, hear from patients who have been experiencing long COVID symptoms, symptoms that are clearly as a result of their infection with COVID, being dismissed by doctors as anxiety, as pandemic stress. It's, I think, quite alarming that even with the media attention that it has gotten and all of the grassroots advocacy that we've done to educate, providers and the community about long COVID, it is not enough. There really needs to be, I think, a stronger, louder government campaign around long COVID for public health, and as well as clinical education to providers, particularly primary care. I mean, you said yourself that primary care is overwhelmed. It's really, really difficult to assess a patient in 15 minutes and get them everything they need.
Let me jump to Ms. Beal and Ms. Helm, just to pick up where Ms. Vasquez left off. How has your, what kind of impact, what kind of effect have you had in terms of reaching out to the medical community? Have you found doctors understanding of the problem? Have you been able to get the help you need, Ms. Beal, for your symptoms? Are others in a similar place?
Thank you so much for your question, Senator. Early on in my long COVID journey, it was difficult to find a doctor that knew what long COVID was. And I even had a doctor tell me that she didn't believe that long COVID was real. So, and that's hard when you know you're sick and you know it's real, and you have a medical professional telling you that they don't believe it. It's hard to get anything out of a conversation like that. I've become more selective in which physicians I see. I ask every single one of them, have you heard of long COVID? Are you treating any other patients with long COVID? And I think in the last year, more of the providers are more aware of long COVID, so that's been very helpful.
Good. Okay, Ms. Helm, you've introduced us to something I think gets even less attention than the overall crisis of long COVID, and that is how it impacts young people. I guess you have, not by choice, become somewhat of an expert on COVID in young people. Can you tell us a little bit about what you have learned as to how many kids are experiencing long COVID, whether they're getting the kind of treatment that they need, how it impacts, a teenager's life? Speak into the mic there, please.
Just being on social media and connecting with all these different groups of parents, a lot of times you get to talk directly with other parents and hear their stories. And there's a lot of parents that are struggling to get treatment for their children. I mean, they're trying all kinds of different, medications, supplements, even hyperbaric chambers. I mean, they're doing anything to try and help their children feel better. And I think the biggest thing in relation to the question about the doctors I come across, the doctors I've been around are not dismissive. They just say, I don't know. I hear that a lot from doctors. I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. So what I do is, because I've got the information from the clinic and the study and stuff, I tell them what I know. I was at the gastroenterologist yesterday and I said, did you know COVID lives in your gut for months after infection? And she said, no, I didn't know that. And I said, well, tell everybody at your office. And then she looked at me and she said, yeah, well, she looked at me and she said, well, how do I do that test? I don't even know how to order that test to see if they have COVID in their stool. And so I think that's part of the problem is the doctors need the information so that they can help the patients. Because they just don't know that COVID is doing this to people, I don't think. They're shocked usually when I tell them the stuff that I've learned.
All right, I'm running out of time. My last question is, what good question did I not ask any of you? All right, then, Ms. Mack,
Yes. I think a question that I would have liked to have answered is why it's important to include patients in research and education for clinicians and providers. And I think we have been living this. We have been living with long COVID since the pandemic began. And patients have been living with, infection-associated chronic diseases for generations. We know this stuff backwards and forwards, not only because we live it, but so many of us have had to do our own research. I am heavily invested in PubMed and Google Scholar. I can read a paper. I send papers to my providers. We are experts from a lived experience, and because some of us are getting in there and doing the research ourselves. So that's why it's important to include us.
see that I knew I would ask a brilliant question, and it was you, Senator Cassidy.
I defer to Senator Dr. Roger Marshall.
Well, thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, again. And this is personal for me. One of my loved ones is one of those 16 million people that suffered from long COVID, incapacitated for some 2 years. People often ask me, well, what?
In my view, we're going to be talking about an issue that has not gotten the attention that it deserves from the medical community, from the media, and certainly from members of Congress, and that is the crisis of long COVID. And long COVID, as we all know, is the fact that after people get COVID, sometimes there are symptoms which simply do not disappear. And we're going to hear from our panelists in a moment about that. So what I would like to say to our panelists, and by the way, we have a full house here, we have an overflow room over there, and I suspect a lot of folks are watching this on TV and on live stream. And I think there is the sense that something is going on in America which is serious that we're not addressing. So I just want to say to our panelists and all those who are dealing with long COVID, we hear what you're experiencing. We take it seriously. We think we have not, as a Congress, done anywhere near enough, and we hope to turn that around. The reality, as we're going to hear from our panelists in a moment, is that long COVID is a very serious illness that can have devastating consequences for those who contract it. In America today, and the estimate is that some 16 million people throughout our country have long COVID. It affects people of all ages and all backgrounds, although we're going to hear a little bit of evidence that it disproportionately impacts people of color and lower income people. For far too many people who were previously healthy, and we're going to hear from a former athlete this morning, who are leading active and productive lives, they have suddenly found themselves bedridden and grappling with strange, debilitating systems that they could not conceive of having gotten as a result of long COVID. And the truth of the matter is, and we'll hear from our experts after we hear from the patients, that we still don't know why. We don't know the cause of the disease. But this is what we do know. We know that long COVID can include more than 200 symptoms, including serious cognitive impairment and severe cardiovascular and neurological problems that can continue for weeks, months, or even years after initial infection. We know that people with long COVID have experienced a wide variety of chronic symptoms, including extreme fatigue, insomnia, migraines, brain fog, dizziness, shortness of breath, loss of smell or taste, and sometimes those diseases can be so debilitating that it leads literally to suicide. It's the case in my own state where a young man, previously healthy, committed suicide as a result of all this. So let us be clear. The symptoms of long COVID are not minor inconveniences. They are debilitating conditions that affect the ability of people to work, to care for their families, and to live full lives. And here is what far too many do not know. Long COVID, and we're going to hear more about this morning, can affect anybody who has had COVID-19, from those who experienced mild symptoms to those who were severely ill. Further, although you may not have long COVID after your first infection, each reinfection can increase the risk of developing it. In other words, if you're under the impression that once you've gotten COVID, you don't need to worry about it ever again, you are mistaken. This is an escalating danger, particularly for those who have suffered repeated infections. It poses a severe threat to public health, and it demands our immediate and focused attention. Now, let's be clear. The impact of long COVID is not just a health issue, it is an economic one as well. It is estimated that as many as 4 million Americans are out of work due to long COVID. The annual cost of those lost wages alone is around $170 billion a year. So what should we do about it? First, we must educate medical professionals on how to adequately diagnose long COVID, better understand the risks associated with it, and identify potential therapeutic options. Far too many patients, and I think we're going to hear a lot about this morning, with long COVID have struggled to get their symptoms taken seriously. And far too many medical professionals have either dismissed or misdiagnosed their serious health problems. This crisis is made even worse by the fact that long COVID patients often require multiple specialists to treat their complex symptoms. The existing shortage of healthcare providers, from primary care to mental health providers, means that far too many Americans are unable to access affordable, high-quality care when they need it. That's another issue that some of us hope we can address in the near future. So let me just conclude by thanking our panelists, both the patients and the experts who we will be hearing from in a moment. And let me give the mic over to Senator Cassidy.
Thank you, Chair Sanders. I'm a doctor, and I worked for a long time with people who had chronic fatigue syndrome.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walker. First, I'm going to offer an apology. I've got an emergency leadership meeting in a while that I'm going to have to run out to, and I'll give the seat here over to Senator Baldwin. Let me start off with this. It goes without saying, I think, that many of us understand that at a time when we, have a major disease which has been under-discussed, underappreciated, that while we have put some federal funding and some good work has been done, much more needs to be done. So to my point, that's a given, all right? But what I want to go beyond that, and it's to ask all of you, starting with Dr. Harkins, is if I am an individual with long COVID, as people in this room are and people in another room are, the overflow room, give us some optimism here. Where do you think we can be going? What are we seeing? Any breakthroughs in terms of understanding the disease and in providing, in the reasonably short term, some treatments for people who are hurting very badly right now? Dr. Harkins?
Thank you. Well, I know we all want answers yesterday because patients are suffering. I think looking globally and with the studies that are going on currently in the U.S., we are finding answers. We are finding trends. We are clustering patients into different subgroups. However, this is really complex, and as my colleagues have mentioned, it affects every organ system. All different cells are involved, and so trying to come up with a one-size-fits-all is not going to work. And so I think we're learning more about muscle dysfunction in the post-exertional malaise patients, for example. Now, what we do with that information, there's actual structural damage that occurs post-exercise. So what we do with that information now will be critical in, what can we do to address that and improve their symptoms at the time, and educating providers so that the patients are heard and felt like they have a partner in this.
Thanks. Dr. Ali?
We've made a lot of progress in understanding the biology of long COVID. We understand what happens in the brain, for example, in a lot of patients with long COVID, low cortisol level, low serotonin level, fusion of the neurons that actually disrupt cognition, and neuroinflammation or inflammation in the brain, and some structural abnormalities in the brain have been documented in people following SARS-CoV-2 infection. So I would understand, I mean, that's really only to talk about the brain. There's a lot of literature also on the heart and other aspects. We made a lot of improvement or progress in understanding the biology of long COVID. And also we do understand quite a bit the epidemiology of long COVID. We understand that, vaccines work, reduce the risk of long COVID. We understand that to some extent antivirals also reduce the risk of long COVID. We also understand that reinfection raises the risk of long COVID. So all of that understanding should feed into some optimism that we've made some progress. I think the major we note lack of progress in clinical trials. As I indicated, they're too slow and too small to yield definitive answers. And really, for the person who is hurting from long COVID, they need that treatment yesterday. And we've, while we've made progress in understanding the biology and epidemiology of long COVID, we definitely need trials and at scale that match the urgency of the problem.
Maddox Brown?
Yes, I'd like to just reiterate what the other witnesses have said, that there's a lot that we understand about the biology. We do know that the clinical trials have been slow. There are some instances in which there have been issues with some of the treatments that are recommended for long COVID. In the early days, exercise was often recommended even for patients that without testing for post-exertional malaise. So I think right now we're really in a phase where there are about, I think, 12 trials in the, that are registered in clinicaltrials.gov that are working on experimental medicines, and I think that we really need investment in this direction to really identify treatments that are working for patients.
Dr. Walker?
Yeah, to reiterate what many of the last panel mentioned, we've seen a lot of these patients that have really not been validated by their primary care providers or subspecialists, and that's because in our illness script as physicians, when we see a normal physical exam, we see a normal diagnostic workup, we're left with, oh, it seems like everything's okay, and clearly it's not. And so just to reiterate, understanding the pathobiological mechanisms not only helps us target medications, helps us understand the disease better, also provides credence to this disease. We can now point to something. This is a real disease. It cannot be refuted. There is scientific evidence of this. And so I think that's something that's really exciting that gives us hope. But again, it gives us targets that we can use in drug trials.
Okay, I am assuming that my time is running out. I'm assuming that all of you believe that the federal government has got to play a much more active role with substantial sums of money for research, development, clinical trials, et cetera. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes.
No doubt.
All right. Senator Cassidy.
I will defer to Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking.
Important votes going to be taking place, and Republicans, Democrats will be meeting in their caucuses, so people are going to be coming in and out. I also think that this hearing is important enough that we extend the time for questioning from the usual 5 minutes to 7 minutes, if that's okay with folks. Let me begin by welcoming the CEOs of Bristol Myers Squibb, Chris Verna, we thank you for being here. CEO of Merck, Robert Davis, we thank you for being here. And the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, Joaquin Duato, for being with us this morning. Thanks very much. There is a lot of discussion in our nation about how divided our people are on many issues, and that is absolutely true. But on one of the most important issues facing our country, the American people, whether the Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Conservative, Progressive, could not be more united. And that is the need to substantially lower the outrageous price of prescription drugs in this country. According to a recent poll, 82% of Americans say the cost of prescription drugs is too high, and 73% say that the government is not doing enough to regulate drug prices. As a nation, we spend almost twice as much per capita on health care as do the people of any other country. $13,000 for every man, woman, and child. And one of the reasons that we spend so much is the high cost of prescription drugs in our country. The outrageous cost of prescription drugs in America means that 1 out of 4 of our people go to the doctor, get a prescription, and they cannot afford to fill that prescription. How many die as a result of that? How many suffer unnecessarily? Nobody knows. But my guess is it is in the millions. And I have talked to many of them in Vermont and around the country. Meanwhile, our insurance premiums are much higher than they should be, and hospital costs are soaring because of the high cost of prescription drugs. Further, the cost of prescription drugs in this country is putting an enormous burden on taxpayers and seniors by raising the cost of Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare alone spends at least $135 billion a year on prescription drugs. So this is not only a personal issue, it is an issue of the federal budget. Meanwhile, as we pay by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs, 10 of the top pharmaceutical companies in America made over $110 billion in profits in 2022. They are doing phenomenally well, while Americans cannot afford the cost of the medicine they need, and the CEOs in general receive exorbitant compensation packages. This morning, we're going to hear a lot from our CEO panelists about how high prices are not their fault, and that the PBMs are forcing Americans to pay much higher prices than they should be paying. But let us be clear. In 2022, Johnson & Johnson made nearly $18 billion in profit, paid its CEO over $27 million in compensation, and spent over $17 billion on stock buybacks and dividends. That same year, Merck made $14.5 billion in profits, handed out over $7 billion in dividends to their stockholders, and paid its CEO over $52 million in compensation. And Bristol-Myers Squibb made $8 billion in profits last year, while recently spending over $12 billion on stock buybacks and dividends, and giving its CEO over $41 million in compensation. Now, why did a majority of members of this committee invite these 3 pharmaceutical CEOs to testify today? And the answer is pretty simple. Mr. Berner, we will want you to explain to the American people why Bristol-Myers Squibb charges patients in our country $7,100 a year for Eliquis, when that same exact product can be purchased for just $900 in Canada and $650 in France. Mr. Duato, we're going to ask you why Johnson & Johnson charges Americans with arthritis $79,000 for Stelara, when that same exact product can be purchased for just $20,000 in Canada and just $12,000 in France. Mr. Davis, please tell us later why Merck charges Americans with cancer $191,000 a year for Keytruda, when that same product can be purchased for $112,000 in Canada and $91,000 in France. And let's be clear, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, and Bristol-Myers Squibb are not just charging higher prices in the United States compared to other countries. They are also charging Americans much higher prices today than they did in the past, even accounting for inflation. From 2004 to 2008, the median price of innovative new drugs sold by these 3 companies was just $14,000, inflation accounted. From 2019 to 2023, where we are today, the median price of new drugs sold by these 3 companies was $238,000. In other words, Americans are forced to pay higher and higher prices for the drugs they need to survive. And let's be clear, the overwhelming beneficiary of these high drug prices is the pharmaceutical industry. How do we know that? Well, That is precisely what they tell their investors. According to their own shareholder reports, Bristol-Myers Squibb made $34 billion selling the blood thinner Eliquis in the United States, compared to just $22 billion in the rest of the world combined. Make their money in the United States. In other words, the U.S. accounts for nearly 2/3 of all global sales of Eliquis. Not a single dollar of this revenue is going to PBMs. 100% of it is going to Bristol-Myers Squibb. Johnson & Johnson has reported to its shareholders that it made over $30 billion in revenue selling the arthritis drug Stelara in the United States since 2016, more than twice as much as the rest of the world combined. Nothing to do with PBMs. Merck has reported to its shareholders that it made $43.4 billion selling the cancer drug Keytruda in the United States, compared to $30 billion in the rest of the world combined. Now, our CEO panelists from the drug companies will tell us this morning how much it costs to develop new drugs and how often the research that they undertake for new cures is not successful. And they are right. We appreciate that. But what they have not told us in their written testimony is that 14 major pharmaceutical companies, including Johnson & Johnson and Merck, spent $87 billion more on stock buybacks and dividends over a recent 10-year period than what they spent on research and development. More on stock buybacks and dividends than in research and development. In fact, Bristol-Myers Squibb spent $3.2 billion more on stock buybacks and dividends in 2022 than it spent on research and development. Johnson & Johnson spent $46 billion more on stock buybacks and dividends than it spent on research and development since 2012. In other words, these companies are spending more to enrich their own stockholders and CEOs than they are in finding new cures and new treatments. Now, the average American who hears all of this is asking a very simple question. How does all of this happen? What's going on? How could drug companies charge us, in some cases, 10 times more than they charge Canadians or people around the world for the same drug? How do they get away with this when so many of our people cannot afford the high price of the drugs that they need? How can it be, uniquely among industrialized countries, that these companies, not just these companies, but the pharmaceutical industry in general, can raise prices anytime they want, to any level they want? Want to raise double prices? Do it any way they want. How do they get away with all of that? And here, in my view, is the answer. The United States government does not regulate drug companies. With very few exceptions, the drug companies regulate the United States government. That is the sad state of affairs in a corrupt political system. Over the past 25 years, the pharmaceutical industry, not just these companies, the entire industry, spent over $8.5 billion on lobbying and more than $745 million on campaign contributions. And let me be fair here. Don't want to misspeak. They are bipartisan. They give to Republicans, they give to Democrats. And I am especially impressed by the Pfizer drug company. Pfizer is not here this morning, contributing $1 million to the Republican Party in Kentucky to expand its headquarters, named after Republican leader Mitch McConnell. But again, it's not just Republicans, it's Democrats as well. Unbelievable. This is an astounding fact. Last year, drug companies had over 1,800 well-paid lobbyists here in D.C. to make sure that Congress did their bidding. There are 535 members of Congress and 1,800 well-paid lobbyists, over 3 for every member of Congress. So if you want to know why you're paying the highest prices in the world, America, that's why. Now, here is some good news in the midst of all that. We are beginning to take on the greed of the pharmaceutical industry. As a result of the Inflation Reduction Act passed several years ago, Medicare, for the first time ever, is beginning to do what every major country on earth does and what the Veterans Administration has been doing for over 30 years, and that is to negotiate the lower prices of drugs, including Januvia, Stelara, and Eliquis. Let me conclude by saying this. I am proud of what this committee up to this point has accomplished. Last year, as you'll all remember, the CEO of Moderna committed during a Health Committee hearing that his company would make certain that no one in America would have to pay for their vaccine out of pocket. We appreciated that. In a separate Health Committee hearing last May, the CEO of Eli Lilly committed that his company would not raise prices on existing insulin products after having, in fact, lowered them. But let's be clear, much more needs to be done. I look forward to hearing from our CEO panelists this morning as to how they are going to go forward to substantially lower the cost of prescription drugs in this country. Before I begin the first round of questions, let me remind our witnesses that while the Health Committee does not swear in witnesses as a general rule, federal law at 18 U.S. Code Section 1001 prohibits knowingly and willingly making any fraudulent statement to the Senate, regardless of whether a person is under oath. I would also say, in response to many of your testimonies, we are aware of the many important life-saving drugs that your companies have produced, and that's extraordinarily important. But I think, as all of you know, those drugs mean nothing to anybody who cannot afford it. And that's what we're dealing with today, that millions and millions of our people cannot afford the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs in this country. Now, my time and the time of all of the members is limited. So we're going to just, I'm going to ask.
Wait, are we starting with the clock?
So my time is limited. So I'm going to start by asking all of you a number of questions, and I would appreciate it if you could respond with a yes or no answer. It turns out that in our dysfunctional and extraordinarily expensive healthcare system, hundreds of thousands of Americans have gone to GoFundMe in order to raise money to pay for their healthcare needs and for their prescription drugs. Let me ask Mr. Davis, if I might, have you ever searched on GoFundMe for your cancer drug, Keytruda?
No, I have not.
Okay. We have. I and my staff have. And we have found over 500 stories of people trying to raise funds to pay for their cancer treatments. One of those stories is a woman named Rebecca, a school lunch lady from Nebraska, with 2 kids who died of cancer after setting up a GoFundMe page because she could not afford to pay for Keytruda. Rebecca had raised $4,000 on her GoFundMe page, but said the cost of Keytruda and her cancer treatment was $25,000 for an infusion every 3 weeks. Mr. Davis, and please, yes or no, is it true that the list price of Keytruda is $191,000 a year in the United States?
That is close to being true, yes.
Thank you. Is it true that that same exact drug can be purchased in Canada for $112,000 a year and $44,000 a year in Japan?
Generally, yes.
Mr. Davis, even though the price of Keytruda is 1/4 of the price in Japan compared to the United States, does your company, does Merck make a profit selling Keytruda in Japan?
We do.
So what I understand is you make a profit selling Keytruda in Japan for 1/4 of the price that you sell it for in the United States. My question to you is a pretty simple one. Will you commit to lowering the price of Keytruda in the United States to the price of Japan?
Well, Senator, I think first I acknowledge the prices in the United States are higher than they are in many of the countries you said, and not for all drugs, but for many drugs, and that's the reality we face. But I think it's also important to point out that you get access in the United States faster and more than anywhere in the world. We have 39 indications for Keytruda across 17 tumor types in the United States. If you look across Europe, it's in the 20s. If you look across Japan, it's in that number or a little bit less. So there is a reason why the prices are different, and we need to be careful because we are also seeing in those markets that they are unwilling to support the innovation. And we are working hard to try to get them to understand the need to help it fund the innovation.
I apologize for cutting you off.
That's fine.
There are two other, but I did want to make this point. Again, we all appreciate the breakthrough in important drugs that you and other companies have produced that save lives. No debate about that. But I do want to point out that after all is said and done, and after all the money we spend on prescription drugs and healthcare in general, the life expectancy in Japan is 9 years longer than it is in the United States. Senator Cassidy talked about Canada. The life expectancy in Canada is 6 years longer than in the United States. Life expectancy in Portugal is 6 years longer. Life expectancy in the UK is 4 years longer. Let me ask the last question to Mr. Davis. As I understand it, you made $52 million in total compensation in 2022. Will you commit to not accepting a single dollar more in compensation until there is not a single GoFundMe page for Keytruda?
Well, I can tell you at Merck, we are very much sensitive to what's happening with patients. That's why we have very important patient assistance programs. We commented on the fact that we have over 800,000 patients benefiting, where we provide free drug for those who can't afford it, as well as other assistance programs that help with copay and others. So we are very committed as a company to doing what we need to do to try to help alleviate the challenges patients face that you're focusing on, and that's my focus as the CEO.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Burnham, with Bristol Myers Squibb. Carolyn from Florida says that she cannot afford Eliquis, and so she will, quote, stop taking it, though I need it to prevent the risk of having a stroke, end quote. Mr. Burnham, again, yes or no, please. The list price of Eliquis is $7,100 a year in the United States. Dr. Melissa Barber, an expert at Yale University, has estimated that it costs just $18 to manufacture a year's supply of Eliquis. $7,100, what we pay $1,800 to manufacture. Is it true that the same exact drug, Eliquis, can be purchased in Canada for $900 a year?
Senator, that's roughly correct.
Let me ask you this. Even at 13% of the cost in the United States, does Bristol Myers make a profit selling Eliquis for $900 a year in Canada?
Senator, we do make a profit.
All right, so you're selling the product for 13% of what in Canada, of what we pay in the United States, and obviously you sell it there because you make money. So, Mr. Burnham, will you commit today that Bristol Myers Squibb will reduce the list price of Eliquis in the United States to the price that you charge in Canada where you make a profit?
Senator, we can't make that commitment primarily because the prices in these two countries have very different systems that prioritize very different things. In Canada, medicines are generally made less available, and it takes oftentimes considerably longer for those medicines to be available, on average, roughly 4 years.
I do apologize. Life expectancy in Canada is 6 years longer than it is in the United States. Mr. Burnham, your company spent over $12 billion on stock buybacks in 2022. Given that reality, can you tell Carolyn why you can't lower the price of Eliquis?
First, Senator, let me say no patient should have to go through the types of choices that the patient you just described go through. It is our commitment to continue to bring down the price of medicines in the U.S., and I would love the opportunity to bring down the price of Eliquis in the U.S. Our net prices, what we are compensated, have actually, over the last 5 years, declined. At that same time, the list prices have increased. Why is that? Because of the complexity of this system and the billions of dollars in rebates that we have provided to intermediaries that unfortunately do not go to lowering the price of medicines like the patient you just described.
Again, I apologize. I want to get very briefly to Mr. Dueto, who's with Johnson & Johnson. Mr. Dueto, is it true that the list price of Stelara is $79,000 a year in the U.S.? Is that roughly right?
It's roughly right, but it's also true that the average discount of Stelara in the US is 70%.
I
So
know
it's
all of that, and we've dealt with PBMs, and we're going to get to that, I'm sure, in this morning. Is it true that while charging $79,000 in the United States, that the exact same product is sold in Spain for $18,000?
I don't know the price in Spain. I can tell you that the average discount in the US is 70%, so the price that you quote is 30% of that.
Okay. Mr. Dueto, is it true that it costs less than $15 a year to manufacture Stelara?
The manufacturing cost is only a component that goes into our pricing. When we price our medicines, we're looking at the value that the medicine brings to the healthcare system, our ability to continue to invest in research. We invested $15 billion last year. And also, we look at affordability. The average copay, if they use our copay assistance programs in the US, for a patient using Stelara is $10 to $15 per month.
I apologize. I'm over my time. I'm going to give Senator Cassidy the same time that I had. Now we'll begin with the questioning. You know, at hearings like this, experts throw out a lot of numbers, and I look at the world a little bit differently than some of our conservative economists in terms of what's happening to working families. But at the end of the day, you got millions and millions of people who have worked their whole lives, are entering retirement, and they're scared to death. And I think, Ms. Chambers, your testimony was extremely moving, because I think you're not just speaking about your own life, or not even about the UAW and union members. You're talking about millions and millions of people. Talk a little bit, not only for your own experience, from your friends, your family, what it's like to have worked, in your case, 17 years for one of the major corporations in America. And as I understand it right now, you have no retirement program, no pension program. On an emotional basis, on a personal basis, what is that like?
So, yeah, we have a 401k, and we got a raise in our 401k, and it's great. It's a good stepping stone. It's a good foot forward. But when I retire, my 401k is based off, and the rest of America now that's in my generation, is based off of what the stock market's doing. I've seen several times in my lifetime where the stock markets went down, and we've lost a lot of money in our 401k. I'm not at retirement age, but when I look at my 401k and the amount of money that was bleeding out of it with the COVID, it makes me very uneasy. It kind of feels like, especially working at Ford, I had a goal post when I first hired in, and then it was, well, you're a temporary employee full-time until further notice. So then now I'm...
Explain to members what being a quote-unquote temporary, you were a temporary employee for 6 years, right?
Yep.
It's a long temp. What does that mean?
So I was considered full-time, so I worked 40, 50, 60 hours a week, but I was locked in at $14 an hour until 2013. And I was expected to do everything a full-time employee did, but I didn't get any of the benefits. And that actually, when I hired in, I questioned what parts of the contract I fell under, and they said, it depends on what we're talking about. So there was never any full, like, here's your book, this is your rules and regulations. It's like, no, we're not going to cover you under that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ms. Ghilarducci, we are, in one sense, the wealthiest country in the history of the world, right? Yeah. A lot of billionaires out there doing very, very well. How does, in your judgment, the American retirement plan, the status of older Americans compared to people around other wealthy nations?
Yeah.
Microphone.
My data really looks at that question. So I compare what people were like when they're approaching retirement 30 years ago, and then take the same snapshot of the generation that looks like them right now. And as I said in my written testimony today, 50% will not be able to meet their retirement standards, and most of them won't be able to meet poverty standard. Compare that to other countries with all different kinds of systems, the Scandinavians, the Germans, the French, even the Italians. Just look at our peers, and we fall way behind. I was looking at the elderly poverty rates. Kazakhstan does better than us. So there's a couple of design issues.
I heard from some of the economists here today that we're doing just great. Things are getting better. Is that
Yeah, so that was my little lesson on averages versus medians. Because the rich have done so well, they have brought up those averages that people who talk about average retirement wealth can point to. It's gone up. But that's because the top 10% got the benefit of retirement tax cuts. They got the benefit of the run-up in the market. They didn't take money out, to buy their houses.
Okay, last question. Thank you very much. Sorry. Mr. Doonan, right now, billionaire pays Social Security taxes on $168,000. That's about it. Massive amounts of untaxed money there despite massive income and wealth inequality. That makes sense to you?
Thank you for the question.
Microphone.
Thank you for the question. I would note that one of the reasons Social Security's financing fell off track is we used to capture 90% of total income, and that was sort of expected to continue. But with rising inequality, I think we're down to about 82 or 81. When these projections were done in the early 80s, I feel like they did a pretty nice job. We had 40 years of level costs. But there are some areas where the projections just didn't come true.
Senator Cassidy. Thank you very much to all of the panelists. Let me just briefly respond to Mr. King's statement about letting the market decide who benefits from the transition to more advanced technology. For the last 50 years, the market has done just that. And the result has been there has been a $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. So after those 50 years, there are millions of workers today who are worse off, while we have more income and wealth inequality than we've ever had in the history of the country. So I am not quite in favor of letting the market decide. All right, let me begin the questioning. We're going to be a little bit, not to offend Senator Cassidy, a little bit liberal here in terms of the time, because we only have a few members here and it's an important subject. I wanted to start off with President Fain. And I don't want to talk about statistics. We've heard a lot of statistics. You have been with the union for over 3 decades. No doubt, as president, you've met thousands of workers, you've met thousands of retirees. Tell the American people what it's like to work on a factory floor. In some cases, by the way, I learned this recently. There are people today in America who are working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. Unbelievable. But President Fain, talk about the impact on the life of a worker mentally, physically, who is doing hard work day after day, year after year. What happens to that person?
Thank you. I find irony in some of the statements I just listened to, but the typical life of a factory worker, and this is union or not, and it's actually worse for non-union workers because they have less rules that govern their workplace. But, when you're, typically many factory workers, many typical schedules in manufacturing are 12-hour schedules, and they're 7 days a week. A lot of these places run around the clock. When you are standing on concrete floors 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, year after year after year, there's a lot of wear and tear on a person's body. As I say, people when they age, they end up, in their older working years, end up getting knee replacements, hip replacements, shoulder surgeries. But I just find an irony in some of this that, mentally, the stress of working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. When you don't get to see your kids, you don't get to go home and have dinner with your kids, you don't get to make sure they're getting their homework done, you don't get to spend quality time with family, or just even if you don't have a family, if you have quality time for yourself. Something sacrificed when you're working 12 hours a day, either sleep or time with family, something else is sacrificed. We only have so much time in a day. But, you know, I find an irony in some of the comments that were made by Mr. King as far as the shortage of workers. You know, I don't believe we have a shortage of workers in this country. I think COVID made people wake up and realize what's important in life. And it's not working for $12 an hour and 12 hours a day and multiple jobs to struggle to get by. So this shortage of workers that we see, I don't believe it's a shortage. I believe it's a fact that people have woke up and they've decided, I'm not going to leave my home for $12 an hour when I can't even afford to pay the bills. And also, you know, going back to, you know, letting the markets determine this, and it's just an HR standard talking point about passing added cost on to the consumer. Well, I witnessed inflation the last 4 years. That wasn't caused by workers. It was caused by two words: corporate greed. It was consumer price gouging. And so, you know, that to me, we got to get focused on the reality here.
Thank you. Dr. Shaw, we are the wealthiest country in the history of the world, and yet we have people who are stressed out. We have a crisis in mental health, a lot of factors for that, and yet we are working longer hours, as I understand it, than the people of any other wealthy nation. How does that happen?
Well, I think a lot of the reason for the long hours in this country have to do with the kinds of things that we've been talking here today, and the fact that the American worker has not had enough power in the market to reduce hours. But there are other aspects as well. One of the things we know from economic studies is that when inequality increases, so do working hours. And so the rise in inequality in the United States, which you referred to earlier, is one of the primary causes of longer working hours in the United States.
Okay. Mr. Leland, from your perspective, this discussion is not just theoretical. You have implemented it. Talk a little bit about the impact that has had the transition to a 4-day work week in your company, the impact that it's had on the workers there.
Yeah, I mean, it's been transformative for our workers. I mean, I've been told that this is one of the most impactful things that they've experienced in their lives, because a lot of these workers are able to spend time with their kids. They are learning new skills. I have someone who works for me who learned how to use AI on those days off and has brought it back into the workplace and is much more efficient as a result. They are learning new skills that are not related to work, but are just participating in their communities, volunteering.
We talk about increased productivity. Are workers more focused when they come back after 3 days off?
Yes. Yeah, so workers are much more focused, that they are better rested, they are dedicated to the task at hand in a different way, and teams stay together longer. The cohesiveness of the organization is much more robust on a 4-day work because you aren't burning people out, you aren't churning through them, you aren't having to deal with turnover costs.
We'll talk about turnover. I mean, one of the great costs to businesses is a lot of turnover and having to train new workers. What do you think the impact of a 32-hour work week would be on that?
It was shocking, honestly, how much it changed turnover and what impact that had on our productivity. I mean, honestly, we've rarely lost an employee in the last 2 years. That means people have longer tenure. We don't have to deal with hiring, the cost of hiring, the time of hiring someone else. Our goals don't get disrupted by the sudden departure of a key employee. I think a 32-hour work week, people want to work. The notion that, I don't know, Americans are lazy, that some people seem to have, is, I think, inaccurate. People want to work, but they want to work in a way that is balanced with the rest of their lives. And they will stay in those jobs longer if the job is balanced with the rest of their lives.
Good. Thanks very much. The Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions will come to order. This has been a shortened week, so I think you're going to see there are hearings taking place all over the place, and I think you're going to see senators drifting in and out. But I want to thank all of our panelists for being with us. This morning, we are going to be talking about an issue that is very rarely discussed in the halls of Congress or the Senate, and that is the need to reduce the standard work week in the United States. In fact, the last time, as we understand it, the Senate held a hearing on this subject was in the year 1955. So I think maybe the time is now to renew that discussion. At that hearing, the Senate heard from Walter Reuther, who was at that point, the head of the United Auto Workers and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and Reuther was regarded as one of the great labor leaders of his time. And this is what Walter Reuther said at that time. He said, quote, "We fully realize that the potential benefits of automation are great, if properly handled. If only a fraction of what technologists promise for the future is true, within a very few years, automation can and should make possible a 4-day work week. The reduction of the work week to 35 or 30 hours in the coming decade can be an important shock absorber during the transition to the widespread use of automation. It can both reduce the impact of sharp rises in output and increase the manpower requirements in industry and commerce." End of quote. And yet today, nearly 70 years later, despite an explosion, as we all know, in technology and a massive increase in worker productivity, nothing has changed. Think about that. Think of the huge transitions we have seen in the economy, but in terms of the work week, nothing has changed. While we have not discussed this issue for a long time in Congress, this is not, needless to say, a new issue. In 1886, one of the central planks of the trade union movement in America was to establish an 8-hour work day with a simple and straightforward demand, quote, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what you will, end quote. That was back in 1886. Americans of that era were sick and tired of working 12-hour days for 6 or 7 days a week with very little time for rest, relaxation, or quality time with their families. They went out on strike, they organized, they petitioned the government and business owners, and they achieved real results after decades of struggle. In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson signed legislation into law to establish an 8-hour workday for railroad workers. 6 years later, the Ford Motor Company became one of the first major employers in America to establish a 5-day work week for auto workers. And here is something I believe that most people in our country do not know. In 1933, the United States Senate overwhelmingly passed legislation to establish a 30-hour work week by a vote of 53 to 30. That was 1933. While that legislation ultimately failed as a result of intense opposition from corporate America, a few years later, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act into law, and a 40-hour work week was established in 1940. My friends, in 1940. Unbelievably, 84 years later, despite massive growth in technology and worker productivity, millions of workers in our country are working longer hours for lower wages. And I hope people hear this, because it's not an issue we talk about enough. Today in America, 28.5 million Americans, 18% of our workforce, now work over 60 hours a week, and 40% of employees in America now work at least 50 hours a week. We were talking about a 40-hour work week 80 years ago, and that's what people today, despite the explosion of technology, are working. The sad reality is Americans now work more hours than the people of any other wealthy nation. And we're going to talk about what that means to the lives of ordinary people. In 2022, employees in the United States, and I hope people hear this, logged 204 more hours a year than employees in Japan, and they're hardworking people in Japan. 279 more hours than workers in the United Kingdom, and 470 more hours than workers in Germany. Despite these long hours, the average worker in America makes almost $50 a week less than he or she did 50 years ago after adjusting for inflation. Now let that sink in for a moment. Think about all of the extraordinary changes in technology that we have seen over the last 50 years. Computers, robotics, artificial intelligence, and the huge increase in worker productivity that has been achieved during that time. In factories and warehouses, robots and sophisticated machinery did not exist then, or were only used in primitive forms. In grocery stores and shops of all kinds, there were no checkout counters that utilized barcodes. As a result of the extraordinary technological transformations that we have seen in recent years, American workers are now over 400% more productive than they were in the 1940s. Extraordinary. Technology has made working people far more productive. And what has been the result of all of that productivity increase for working people? Almost all of the economic gains of that technological transformation have gone straight to the top, while wages for workers have remained stagnant or even worse. While CEOs today are making 350 times as much as their average employees, workers throughout the country are seeing their family life fall apart as they are forced to spend more and more time at work. They're missing their kids' birthday parties, Little League, baseball games, and just the time they need with their family. And what stresses them out even further is that after spending all of this time at work, many of them still are living paycheck to paycheck, can't take care of their basic needs. At a moment in history when artificial intelligence and robotics, and I hope we all understand that the jobs that people have today ain't going to be there in many cases in 15 years. Our economy is going to be transformed through artificial intelligence and robotics. The question that we are asking today is a pretty simple question. Do we continue the trend that technology only benefits the people on top, or do we demand that these transformational changes benefit working people? And one of the benefits must be a lower work week, 32-hour work week. This is not a radical idea. France, the 7th largest economy in the world, has a 35-hour work week, and is considering a 32-hour work week. Norway and Denmark is about, their work week is about 37 hours, and Belgium has already adopted a 4-day work week. And what we're going to hear today is there are companies all over our country and all over the world that have adopted the 40-hour work week. And you know what they found? They found that productivity actually went up because workers were able to focus on their work. They were not exhausted. They were happy to go to work. So the issue that we are talking about today is of enormous importance. Who benefits from the exploding technology? The wealthiest people who are doing phenomenally well, or working people who are falling behind? And with that,
Senator Sanders.
Well, Chairman Whitehouse, thanks very much for holding this important hearing, and let me thank all of the panelists for being here. If a large corporation knowingly produces a product that gets me sick or kills me, I would assume that we have an abundance of laws to prosecute that company and to hold them accountable and to demand punitive damages. My dad, like so many other people, smoked several packs of cigarettes a day. He died, I suspect, largely because of that, as did millions of other Americans who were lied to by the tobacco industry. And I remember as a kid seeing doctors in white coats on television smoking cigarettes, telling the American people how flavorful and good these cigarettes were while they were killing the American people. So I'd like to ask Ms. Eubanks a simple question. If we have an industry that knowingly, and that's the point, knowingly understood that carbon emissions were causing climate change, knowingly understood that climate change will bring devastating destruction to the lives of billions of people, what are the legal grounds that we can hold them accountable for? Ms. Eubanks?
Well, a lot of it would depend on whether it was in a state or the federal government. The federal government RICO statute, of course, has provisions that we used in the tobacco litigation and was a way to bring all of the claims under the same umbrella. Conspiracy is a good claim to look at in a lot of the statutes that are involved in consumer protection laws.
All right, if you were Attorney General of the United States, would you proceed in that direction?
I would, yes. No question.
Okay. Any thoughts as to why the current Attorney General is not going forward in that direction?
It's probably not really appropriate for me to comment on that since I don't know anything about what the current Attorney General is doing besides what I read in the papers.
I mean, the damage, I don't remember exactly what the settlement for tobacco was. It was huge. I mean,
it wasn't a settlement. I won. It was a 9 months trial. And the companies were ordered to change the way they do business. And I think that type of order, not involving money, but money's great, don't get me wrong. That could be another part of any end to a case where you're talking about what the damages or the remedies would be. But getting a company to change the way it did business, that's what we got out of tobacco.
Okay,
and it took years.
But we also got money, the states, I guess, got the money.
The states got money, they got, yes,
All right,
correct.
let me ask Mr. Sopran a question. What, in your judgment, are the similarities between the actions of big tobacco and what we're seeing with the fossil fuel industry today?
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, as I said during my opening statement, big oil is frankly the new big tobacco. My colleagues and I have published an article called America Misled, where we lay out the evidence for these similarities. They are multifold, from the strategies to the personnel.
Have they been consistently lying?
The oil industry.
Yes.
They have been consistently misleading the public about the realities and implications of their products, yes.
And if you have a huge entity in the United States, the fossil fuel industry, the oil companies, misleading the American people, not allowing us or having the information to take the kind of actions that we should have taken dozens of years ago. What are the implications of that?
So it's important to clarify this. I'm not a lawyer, but as my statement made very clear, we have the receipts. We have overwhelming evidence that this industry has known since twice my lifetime about the dangers of their products, and they knowingly and deliberately created a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar campaign to confuse.
And the results of that is that countries all over the world were very slow-moving in attempting to deal with climate change. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. It's enshrined in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's most recent assessment that this history of disinformation and lobbying has delayed action on climate change worldwide.
Do you have any understanding of how many hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars in damage will take place as a result of that misleading campaign?
It's hard to ascribe specific dollar values to specific actions because obviously we live in a complex, multi-connected society. But at the same time, and also I'm not an economist, but economists have studied this, estimate that by around 2030, the consequences of global warming could include a $240 billion COVID-like economic shock every 5 years. So this is very much,
years.
Yeah.
Well, in my view, it should not be state government or the federal government having to pick up the bill. I think it's time to ask the people who caused that problem, who lied about that situation, to pick up the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sanders.
Senator Sanders.
Let me thank all of the panelists for their testimony. I think we can all agree that the issue we're discussing today is an emotional issue. It is a difficult issue, and sincere people have different points of view on the issue. I would like to direct my questioning to Drs. Verma and Linton and ask them this. No doubt you have experienced women and their partners who have jumped for joy when they learned that they were pregnant, and you did everything you could to make sure that the pregnancy was successful. I suspect you have also met with many women who, for a variety of reasons, whatever they may be, health reasons, economic reasons, did not jump for joy when they learned that they were pregnant. My question to you is a pretty simple one. I'm assuming that you have worked with people, all walks of life, all economic levels, races, so forth. Who do you think is best prepared to make the decision about the future of that pregnancy? Is it people in a legislature, generally speaking, often dominated by men? Or would it be the people who are feeling the impact of that pregnancy? So understanding, I would suspect you've never told anybody they should not have an abortion, right? We respect people's different points of view. Who should make that decision based on your experience, Dr. Verma?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Based on my experience, people are the experts in their own lives and are able to make these really complicated decisions about their own lives. And I want to say I appreciate Senator Mullin sharing that story. I myself have struggled with infertility, and I've experienced a first trimester miscarriage that I found devastating. And so I am not at all saying that pregnancies don't have value. That value is different for different people, and the way that people connect with their pregnancies is different, and each person is capable of making these really important, sometimes complex, sometimes difficult decisions about their health care and their life, even if that sometimes means ending a pregnancy.
Dr. Linton, on this enormously personal decision,
Yeah,
should it be a state legislature that makes it for every woman in the state, or should it be the woman herself?
I agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Verma. I think this is a decision that only the patient can make. Every single patient situation is unique. Our patients live very complicated lives. And I think that we have to trust them. Our job as physicians is to meet patients where they are, provide them the information that they need, and then support them in whatever decision they make for themselves and for their futures.
All right, let me ask the doctors again. If you were a young physician wanting to practice medicine, would you gravitate to a state which has a harsh anti-abortion law?
Yeah, thank you. This is really difficult for me. I'm from the South. I love the South. It is my home, and it has been really hard to grapple with wanting to serve my community, but being in an environment where I have to face threats of criminal prosecution, of having my license removed for simply providing medicine. And so I have had thoughts about leaving, even though I love my home and my community, and I talk to medical students and residents every day who are in that same position. They love the South, they're from the South, but are choosing to leave because they can't get the training and they can't practice in the way that
At a time when there is already a shortage of physicians in that area, correct?
Yes, and in Georgia, 50% of counties do not have an OBGYN. And as doctors leave, that doesn't just affect access to abortion care. It affects access to all types of care, to prenatal care, to miscarriage management. I often already at the hospital I work at see patients coming to labor and delivery who have received no prenatal care because they haven't had access to that care. That's just going to get worse and worse and make pregnancy riskier and more dangerous.
Dr. Linton, your experience regarding that?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the concerns that I hear from trainees are sort of twofold. The first is similar to what Dr. Verma was speaking about, wanting to make sure they receive that comprehensive training. They want to be able to go into practice and feel prepared that they can provide whatever care is necessary to serve their patients. But I think it's also important to remember most of our trainees are of reproductive age, and they also need to think about what would happen if they experienced an unintended pregnancy or an unexpected health outcome. So yeah, I have heard from many of my trainees concerns about staying in state, or certainly about thinking about these restrictions when deciding where they aim to practice in the future.
Thanks. Thank you. 2 years ago, 6 Supreme Court justices, all nominated by Republican presidents, decided to overturn Roe v. Wade, abolish the constitutional right for women to have an abortion, and to give politicians in state government the right to control the bodies of women in state after state. This morning, we will be holding a hearing to take a hard look at how this Supreme Court decision, the Dobbs decision, has impacted women, physicians, and healthcare providers throughout our country. In a few minutes, I am going to be handing the gavel as chair of the committee to Senator Patty Murray, because given the subject matter, I think it's appropriate for a woman to chair this important hearing. And this is an issue that Senator Murray has been deeply and passionately involved in for many, many years. But before I hand the gavel over to Senator Murray, let me say a few words on a subject I feel very, very strongly about. It is no secret to anyone that throughout our country's history, women have had to fight for their basic human rights against all forms of patriarchy and sexism. No great secret. Women had to struggle, and some died, in order to achieve the right to vote, something which they did not receive until 1920. Women had to struggle for the right to get the education that they wanted all over America. Women wanted to go to this school, wanted to do that, couldn't get into the door because they were women. Women had to struggle to get banks to lend them the money they needed to buy a car or start their own business. In fact, up to 1974, banks in America could legally refuse to issue a credit card to a woman simply because she was a woman. Women struggled to choose the careers they wanted. In the 1950s, it was legal for employers to fire women for the crime of getting married. She got fired because she chose to get married. Up until 1964, it was legal for employers in America to reject a job applicant simply because the applicant was a woman. The struggle for equal pay, for equal work, continues to this day. In America today, women working full-time make just 84 cents on the dollar compared to men. And on it goes. Women struggling for their basic human rights. Then on January 22nd, 1973, after decades and decades of struggle, women in America finally won the right to control their own bodies as a result of the Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade. No longer would state governments be able to tell women what they could or could not do with their own bodies. And when we talk about the history of how all of these happened, let's not ignore the lack of political representation that women had. In 1987, not so many years ago, there were 2 women in the United States Senate and 98 men. Those are the folks all over this country who are making the decision. The truth is that men would not tolerate them being subject to government decisions regarding how they can control their own bodies. I am not aware of any state in this country that has ever restricted the right of a man to get Viagra or any other medication prescribed by a doctor. I'm not aware of any state in this country that has prevented a man from getting a vasectomy or any other medical procedure that men choose to get that has been approved by a doctor. You know, we hear a lot of talk about freedom in this body. Freedom to do what you want to do. And yet, right now, we are living at a time when half of our population or more has lost that freedom. And by the way, when I talk about the right of women to be able to control their own bodies, it's not just me talking, it's what the American people believe in poll after poll, in state election after state election. People are saying we may disagree politically, may disagree on this or that issue, but very strongly, the American people believe it is women, not the government, that has a right to control their own body. I think when we look at the issue of education in America and the challenges, significant challenges we face, it's also important to take a look at how, as a nation, we feel about our kids. Are our children a very high priority? Does anyone really think that as a nation we believe that? Now, if we believe that, we would not have 9 million children living in poverty. We would not have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any nation on earth. Dr. Kerwin has looked at countries around the world. Many countries around the world understand that the most important years of emotional and intellectual development are 0 through 5. That's what we are told by every psychologist who studies the issue. And yet we have a child care system which A, is unaffordable for millions of working class families, B, pays child care workers even worse than we pay public school educators. People are working for less than McDonald's, doing some of the most important work in the country. And yet, as Dr. Kerwin mentioned, there are countries around the world, and perhaps Maryland is beginning to do that, to say, you know what? Childcare is enormously important. If kids are going to get off to a good start in life, open the doors. Let's have decent paid teachers, and let's not worry about the cost of that, because we're going to save money long term if these kids do well in school. Okay? So I think as a nation, we do have to ask ourselves a fundamental question about our priorities. If 4 hedge fund managers today, at a time when we have massive income wealth inequality in America, 4 hedge company executives making more money than every kindergarten teacher in this country, maybe there's something wrong with our national priorities. This country does not survive unless we have the best education in the world for our kids. We're not going to compete economically. We're not going to see our kids flourish. So I'm always impressed that when it comes to defense spending, hey, we could spend $1 trillion a year, bills come out of committee 20-1, no debate. Massive tax breaks to billionaires, hey, not a problem. But maybe to address why it is that we're paying teachers in this country inadequate wages, oh my word, that's just an impossible task. Federal government can't get involved in it. So I think it's time not only to take a hard look at education in general, but to take a look at our national priorities and to take a look at how we treat the children of our country. And with that, this hearing comes to an end. Any senators who wish to ask additional questions must do so by June 27th at 5 p.m. Committee stands adjourned. Thank you. And pensions will come to order for a hearing on an issue of enormous consequence, and I want to thank all of our panelists and guests who are here with us this morning. During the course of the morning, senators will be coming in and out, but I know that this is an issue of interest to every senator. In a moment, we will hear directly from educators from across our country about the enormous effort it takes to provide a quality public education for every child in our country. In my view, if we are serious about the need for a bright and hopeful future for our country, we understand that the children, the young people of this country, are our future. And there is, in fact, nothing more important that we can do than provide a quality education to all of our young people. And yet, for decades, public school teachers have been overworked, underpaid, understaffed, and maybe most importantly, underappreciated. Compared to many other occupations, our public school teachers are more likely to experience higher levels of anxiety, stress, and burnout, which was only exacerbated by the pandemic. As a result, nearly 8% of teachers leave their profession each and every year, double the rate in countries like Canada and countries around the world. According to the most recent statistics, some 300,000 teaching professions, nearly 10% of all teaching professions nationwide, have been left vacant or filled by teachers not fully certified for their assignments. In addition, teacher turnover rates are 50% higher in school districts with high poverty rates than districts that serve wealthier students. In other words, the areas where we need the best teachers the most are the areas where we're seeing the highest turnover. Incredibly, 44% of public school teachers are now quitting their profession within 5 years. Now, why is that? Why are so many public school teachers, people who came into the profession, because of their love of kids and their wanting to do the right thing, why are they leaving that profession? Why do we have a massive shortage of teachers in America? Well, there are many reasons, but one of them, and one of the primary reasons, is the extremely low pay teachers receive. According to the statistics that I have seen, the average starting teacher salary in America is less than $45,000 a year. Nearly 40% of school districts in our country pay teachers a starting salary of less than $40,000. Incredibly, the average public school teacher in America is making nearly $100 a week less than she or he did 28 years ago after adjusting for inflation. In other words, the real salaries of teachers are actually going down in inflation-adjusted numbers. Wages for public school teachers are so low that in 36 states throughout America, the average public school teacher with a family of 4 qualifies for food stamps, public housing, or other government benefits. In America today, nearly 20% of public school teachers in our country are forced to work 2 or 3 jobs during the school year. Maybe they are driving an Uber, maybe they are waiting tables, maybe they're parking cars. In the richest country in the history of the world, seems to me that we have got to do a lot better than that. Meanwhile, because of lack of resources and tight school budgets, about 80% of public school teachers are forced to spend their own money on classroom supplies without being reimbursed, which comes out to about 13% of their first monthly paycheck. The situation has become so absurd, and this tells us not just about how we feel about education and teachers, but maybe our sense of priorities as a nation. The situation has become so absurd that 4 hedge fund managers on Wall Street made more money last year than every kindergarten teacher in America, nearly 120,000 teachers. 4 hedge fund managers, more money than 120,000 kindergarten teachers. Public school teachers should not be forced to work 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. They should not be forced to be on food stamps. Further, as bad as everybody in this room knows, it's not the teacher that keeps the classroom going. They need support service. And as bad as public school teachers are paid, our nation's school custodians, food service workers, and other school staff earn even less. In America today, nearly 40% of support staff in our public schools earn less than $25,000 a year. Now, it would seem to me that we would want as a nation to attract the best and the brightest people into the enormously important profession of education. And if we're going to do that, if we're going to encourage teachers to teach in underserved communities, if we're going to improve teacher retention and morale, and if we're going to improve student academic outcomes, then in my view, we need to pay teachers in America decent wages and decent benefits. Not a very, I think, radical or controversial concept. And that is why I've introduced the Pay Teachers Act with 9 of my colleagues this Congress. This bill would make sure that no teacher in America is paid less than $60,000 a year. It would increase wages for teachers who have made teaching their profession, those who have been on the job for 10, 20, or 30 years. It would triple Title I funding, get money into those school districts that need it the most. It would invest in federal programs to provide teachers with the training, education, and preparation they need to succeed, and it would benefit every public school district in our country. Now, here is the good news, and it is very good news, and that is a result of local organizing led by public school teachers. Some states are beginning to do the right thing. In recent years, the state of New Mexico has increased teacher pay by an average of 20%. State of Maryland recently became the first state in the country to require all teachers to be paid a competitive salary that is at least $60,000 a year by July of 2026. The state of Arkansas recently increased minimum teacher salaries from $36,000 a year to $50,000 and provided a minimum $2,000 raise for all teachers during the 23-24 academic year. And the state of Mississippi recently increased teacher pay by 11%. Raising teacher salaries to at least $60,000 a year and ensuring competitive pay for all of our teachers is one of the most important steps we can take to address the teacher shortage in America and to improve the quality of public education in our country. Bottom line, as everybody knows, the young people are our future. And we've got to deal with the reality that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major nation on earth, and that we are not attracting, because of inadequate salaries, the kinds of people we need into teaching. So let me just conclude by thanking the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of teachers in this country. You are heroes, you are heroines, you are doing enormously important work. You are saving children's lives every single day, and I thank you very much for what you do. Senator Cassidy. We are waiting for another senator. In the meantime, I think Senator Cassidy and I had a few questions we'd like to ask. This has been a very interesting hearing, and I think everybody, regardless of where you're coming from, understands that the root cause of the crisis of medical debt is the high cost of health care in America. And the interesting discussion is to why we are spending twice as much per capita on health care as any other nation, and our outcomes are often not as good. I would mention to folks there was a study recently at the Peterson Foundation which talked about administrative costs. Now, I would hope that most of us agree that if we spend $1 on healthcare, we want to go to a doctor or a nurse or some medicine. We don't want to go to some bureaucrat hounding or some bill collector hounding Ms. Ward or Dr. Chino, who's worried about family members. Not a very good investment in healthcare dollars. Just for the record, in Japan, they spend about $70 a year per person on administrative costs. Sweden, $70, Italy, $74, Australia, $148, France, $306, Switzerland, expensive, $528. The United States, we spend $925 per person, not on doctors, nurses, but on bureaucracy. All right? Brief answer. Now I'm going to give you my view. You tell me what you think about it. And this really raises an interesting question with Senator Cassidy. We may want to do another hearing, really. I think that the function of a rational, humane healthcare system is to guarantee healthcare to all people, regardless of income, as a human right. I think it's wrong if somebody says to Bill Cassidy here, Bill, sorry, you have cancer. Too bad you're going to die because you can't afford the treatment. I don't think that that's what a civilized society should have. That is what exists right now. Dr. Sayed, now go right down the line to everybody. What should be the function of a sane, humane, cost-effective healthcare system? Doctor?
I'd say it's to prevent the illnesses that can be prevented, treat the illnesses that can be treated, and to prevent the adverse consequences of getting sick in the first place.
Dr. Messak?
To look out for patients. That's the oath I take, and that should be the function of our healthcare system.
Regardless of income?
Amen. Yes, absolutely.
Ms. Ward?
To help all families and children thrive in any way that they can, the best way that they can.
Dr. Chino?
I think our health insurance system, our health care system should invest in the American people, because when you invest in the American people, it will always pay out for you.
Dr. Bai?
I believe we should make all the stakeholders able to benefit themselves. Then eventually that will benefit society as a whole. Everybody wants to be rich. Through competition, then people innovate and eventually drag down price and improve quality, benefiting all Americans.
Dr. Polito?
I think the goal should be to balance cost and the innovation that generates lots of health that we enjoy.
I just read statistics. I think there is no denying, or somebody can deny it if you want, that our system is not only the most expensive, it is the most complicated, the most bureaucratic. Everybody in America spends half their lives filling out forms, arguing with insurance companies, all of which cost an enormous amount of money. Dr. El-Sayed, what is the solution for creating a simple, cost-effective healthcare system?
We've heard a lot about providers and payers, and it's important for us to differentiate between those two. Healthcare providers are the doctors, the hospitals, the folks you see to get care. That should stay private. It encourages competition, and competition is good. But there is no innovation. There is no improvement on the insurance side. This is an industry that sits as a middleman between individuals.
What is the function of the insurance industry?
In theory, they're supposed to protect you from the financial consequences of getting sick.
In
reality, it's to make a lot of money for CEOs of large health insurance corporations.
Dr. Mesak?
I agree. We have to cut out the middlemen in healthcare. There's way too much money floating around between patients and the healthcare providers that's never benefiting patients at all.
Why is it, anybody jump in, that we are spending less than half as much per capita on primary health care than virtually every other major country, where I think we all understand the function of a good healthcare system is to keep people healthy? What role do the insurance companies? Do the insurance companies make any money by keeping you healthy? Dr. Chino?
No, sir, they do not.
Dr. El-Sayed?
Yeah, I'll say as a public health official, this is a place of mass frustration because in theory we should, but we've made Medicare the insurer of last resort rather than the insurer that should cover you your whole life. And so what happens is any investment that they make in prevention early on is going to redound to Medicare's benefit. So there's really no incentive for them to invest up front in keeping you healthy, but rather we have a situation where they're being subsidized over the long term, and so that prevention is not happening.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me begin the round of questioning by mentioning that last week the governor of Illinois signed legislation into law to cancel up to $1 billion in medical debt with an investment of just $10 million in state funding. That sounds like a pretty good deal. We're talking about 1 cent on the dollar to cancel debt. Dr. El-Sayed, is that similar to what you're doing in Michigan? Why is that an effective way to go forward to take the burden of medical debt off of the backs of vulnerable people?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the ratio of 1 cent on the dollar is exactly what we're pursuing in Wayne County. And it demonstrates the fact that though prices have gotten higher, those nominal prices are somewhat arbitrary. And the reality is that after non-payment of a medical debt, the value of that debt falls precipitously. And so we have a situation where I would argue that it's actually exactly the inverse of what my esteemed colleague, Dr. Ippolito, shared, which is that we have a situation right now where hospitals and providers, in effect, will create a certain number and say that's the price of the care. And people can't afford it, but they bank on the fact that a lot of people, because of the kind of beggaring that they get, will try and do so anyway.
How many people do you think you can help by removing their debt for how much money in Wayne County?
We estimate about 300,000.
For how much?
For about $7 million.
That sounds like a pretty good deal.
Yeah.
Dr. Mesak, in America, 1 out of every 4 cancer patients either declared bankruptcy or lost their homes to eviction or foreclosure as a result of medical debt. Is there any other country in the world where that takes place?
No, not in the rich world. Countries as rich or close to as rich as the United States do not see this level of catastrophic health expenditure, not even close. We outpace the nearest OECD country by more than 2 times. So you are right that that's not something we see.
All right. And if I am diagnosed with a terrible disease, I worry about that a whole lot. My family worries about that. What impact on my health and my well-being does the worry about financial ruin mean to me?
Thank you, Senator. As Dr. Chino said, and as I mentioned in my testimony, there are so many consequences to worrying about health, and we know that patients who are in financial distress after a diagnosis, who are facing these medical debts, do not adhere to treatment recommendations. They're more likely to die, and this has been proven time and time again from the RAND study in the 70s and to the QJE study just this year. So it's a tremendous health consequence.
Ms. Wood and Dr. Chino, you both have dealt with serious, in one case fatal, illness in the family. What role were bill collectors playing during this process when you were worried about your kids and you were worried about your husband, Dr. Chino? Ms. Wood?
I think it's just the ever constant threat of someone calling to inquire for something that we were not able to pay.
Does that happen often?
I would say multiple times a day, up to
Multiple times a day?
Yeah, I would say oftentimes we were in the NICU visiting our children, and we would get calls from debt collectors asking for payment before the boys were ever discharged from the hospital. It caused a tremendous amount of stress on our family, up to the point that we debated not answering our phone many times if we were not with the boys, because we were worried if it was the hospital or a debt collector calling. But we had to answer because, of course, it was the hospital.
So your kid's in the hospital, and you're getting multiple calls a day
Correct.
from bill collectors.
We had 2 children, so double the calls.
Dr. Chino, do you want to elaborate on that, or?
I just want to say how common this is and how heartbreaking it is, that I know from my personal experience, but also that our patients are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, how excruciating these calls are, how harassing and threatening the messages are. I have patients
Elaborate on that a little bit. Threatening, what does that mean? You're dealing with somebody who is very, very ill, right? That's your main concern. What does that mean, threatening?
So, saying this is going to affect your credit, your ability to do anything in the future. We're going to take your home. We're going to take your car. Where your future is over. Basically, I have found that debt collectors will play every dirty trick that they can to try to get you to give them some money. And it's just one extra layer of stress that when you're dealing with, for me, my husband was in the ICU for a month. It's intolerable.
To say the least. I mean, so what we're talking about is a wife worried about a husband in the ICU, or a mother worried about her kids struggling for their lives, having to field off calls from debt collectors. I mean, if that's not obscene, I don't know what is obscene. Senator Kessler.
You have our commitment, both myself and I think Senator Barrasso feels the same, very strongly.
Mr.
Further
Chairman, as someone who used to work with FERC and file applications and permits, I want to also be involved in this conversation, because our regulatory process has to keep track of technology. And the FERC hydro regulations are really dealing with impoundments, dams, fish passage. This is an entirely different case, and I do commend Senator Murkowski for bringing it forward, and look forward to working with you on this.
And we have a 5-member FERC now, and I think we can get this done. Okay? Further? Senator Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to call up Sanders Amendment number 53.
Number 53, Sanders Amendment. I think that's in what, Title VI?
Yeah.
Okay. Senator Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It should be no secret to members of this committee, I hope, that climate change is real. It is devastating, causing massive impacts in our own country and around the world, and it is only getting worse. I will tell you, and it's extremely hurtful to me, troublesome to me, that just last night, 2 communities in Vermont, St. Johnsbury and Lindenville, experienced torrential rainfall, massive damage. Last week we had a massive flood. A year ago we had a massive flood. All of this in a way that we have not seen for 100 years. I would hope that at this point, every person on this committee understands that climate change is an existential threat to this country and to the planet. And that's not me talking about it. That's what virtually every scientist who studies the issue agrees with. And yet, given all that we know, the United States Congress is still considering legislation to provide a huge giveaway to big oil to drill, produce, and sell more fossil fuels. Just one provision in this bill, Title VI, liquefied natural gas exports, will greenlight 5 massive LNG projects that will lock in annual carbon emissions equal to 165 coal plants. This includes the CP2 LNG terminal in Louisiana, which would be the largest LNG export facility ever built. Don't believe me? Let's look at what Senator Barrasso said when he introduced this bill, and I quote my friend John Barrasso, quote, "We permanently end President Biden's reckless ban on natural gas exports," end of quote. Am I quoting you correctly, Senator Barrasso? All right. Yesterday, more than 360 environmental organizations, 360 environmental organizations wrote to members of this committee urging them to reject this bill. This is what they said, 360 environmental organizations. Quote, "This legislation guts bedrock environmental protections, endangers public health, opens up tens of millions of acres of public lands and hundreds of millions of acres of offshore waters to further oil and gas leasing, gives public lands to mining companies, and would de facto rubber stamp gas export projects that harm frontline communities and perpetuate the climate crisis," end of quote. It is my view that we should reject this legislation altogether, but what I am here to do today is to offer an amendment that would strike Title VI, which locks us into carbon emissions equal to 165 coal plants each and every year. For the sake of our kids and future generations, I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and ask for a roll call vote on Sanders Amendment 53. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any other discussions on this? If not, I have a statement to make here that I would like to.
Thank you very much, Representative, and thank you for your work in being here today. You know, Senator Cassidy, what comes to my mind, above and beyond the discussion we're having, Massachusetts is supposedly one of the progressive states, Louisiana one of the conservative states, and we're hearing the same story, aren't we? We're hearing about decent, hardworking healthcare workers trying to maintain a rotten system based on outrageous greed. We're hearing communities being impacted, whether in Louisiana or Massachusetts, and we're seeing that all over the country. I want to pick up on a point that every one of you made, and that is the spillover impact that the collapse of a healthcare facility has on other facilities in the region. In Vermont, Massachusetts, Louisiana, we're all stressed in healthcare. If a system closes down, if a hospital closes down, it's not like, hey, no problem, other people will pick it up. So maybe just go right down the list. Mayor, do you want to start off? What in your community, what is the impact on other facilities?
Well, definitely the other two facilities in Ouachita Parish are overwhelmed. The ERs are full, the beds are full. So not only are the patients having to wait, but the employees that work there are stressed. They're overwhelmed.
Say a word on that, and maybe somebody else. All of you mentioned this in one way or another. You have decent people. I'm always amazed, I got to tell you. I have had nurses in tears in my office, not worrying about their wages, but brokenhearted that they cannot provide the quality of care they have been trained and want to do. And what I'm hearing from all four of you is you have great workers, stressed out, overwhelmed. Who wants to talk about the impact of what Stewart has done on the employees of the various facilities? Anyone want to jump in? Ms. Sprague?
Hi, thank you.
Talk a little bit closer to the mic.
Yeah, the impact for the healthcare workers, nurses, doctors, everybody is, you go there, you become, I can speak as a nurse, you want to take care of people, you want to help people. Nobody's working this hard in this situation for any other reason. And when you have, in the emergency department where I worked, you have sick, critical patients and not enough physical people to take care of them all. You have to go to the most emergent situation, which means you know that there's some poor little elderly woman in her bed that's in pain, that's not getting her pain medication, or, incontinent and needs to be cleaned up. And in the back of your head, you know that that needs to be done, but you can't physically get there, and there's not a physical time to do it. And those are the things that keep you up at night, where you're like, oh my God, that poor woman, and it wasn't that you didn't want to, you just physically could not get to it because of the life-threatening things or the urgent things you have to prioritize. And it was everywhere at every level. Everybody was trying to make up for what Stewart wasn't putting in and wasn't investing. We had to invest with our own work. And
so I'm hearing that there has been an enormous emotional toll on people who see suffering, who want to address it, and are unable to do so.
Yeah.
Not to mention, one of you mentioned people actually taking money out of their own pockets to buy necessities. Ms. McGinnis, did you want to add to that, or?
Thank you, Senator Sanders. I have spent the past 12 years since we realized, it took us a little bit of time to realize what a bad player Stewart was, and I've spent countless hours sitting across the table from Stuart at least twice a month at staffing and labor management meetings and saying, this is unsafe, this is untenable, we can't do this. We represent hundreds of nurses who just sometimes struggle to come into work, to put one foot in front of another. It's just, it ruins you. A lot of people who used to work full-time, 36 hours a week, cut down their hours now. When people are that stressed, they cut down their hours and they just don't feel like they can do it anymore. It's the moral injury that occurs when you're unable to do the one and only thing you want to do, and that's to keep patients safe and to take care of the best care that you can of a patient, of all my patients. But for the greed of Stuart in the way they deliberately, and it almost feels malicious, deprive me of my colleagues, my support system, my supplies, my equipment, I'm just worn out.
Thank you. Senator Cassidy?
I would defer to Senator Romney. If the companies currently have them in development. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, I just want to pick up on Senator Hassan's important point. We have in writing, and we will certainly share it with you, commitments from the 3 major PBMs that if you substantially lower your list price, they would not limit coverage. Now, what I'm hearing from you is that you are prepared, Novo Nordisk is prepared to sit down and work with those 3 companies. I am prepared to negotiate that, work with you. Do I have your commitment that you will sit down with the 3 companies to make sure that they keep that commitment?
Yes, anything that can help patients get access, I'm supportive of, and that also includes collaborating and negotiating with anyone who can help that.
All right, but picking up on Senator Hassan's point, if in fact they keep their commitment, are you then prepared to substantially lower the list prices in the United States?
I have to understand what this entails, because when I hear statements that PBMs would accept a low list price product, it needs to go all the way to patients. So it means that they talk about insurance companies being their clients. It's actually their owners. So it needs to get to insurance schemes, and it needs to get to the patients. Because
I am aware of that.
Yeah.
All right, but I'm asking you again, A, will you work with this committee and the PBMs?
Yes.
Number 2, if in fact they keep their word, and I understand that it's complicated, will you in fact substantially lower list prices in this country?
If it works in a way where patients get access to a more affordable medicine, and we have, certainty that it actually happens, and not like when we lowered list price prior rounds around, that less people got access to our medicines.
Right, I understand that.
We will be positive towards that.
We will be in touch with you and the PBMs to work on this, and I want to thank Senator Hassan for that line of questioning. Senator Cassidy.
I'll defer to Senator Romney.
My goodness, Senator Cassidy, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, appreciate the chance to have this witness here. Appreciate your willingness to be here. I don't know whether it's voluntary or not, but